This is the fourth part of the third lecture series on measurement and validity, where we focus on the concept of external validity. External validity, properly defined, is the degree to which inferences made based on a study are likely to generalize to other settings or groups of people, potentially using different but related measures. So part of that idea is that it actually, part of the ability for a study to be externally valid should also be tied up with measurement validity, which is why measurement is so key to the entire scientific process. And what we see when we think about these three broad classes of studies, we've defined lab experiments, field or quasi experiments, and then on to observational research, is the exact inverse of what we saw with internal validity. Lab experiments, which have fairly high or have the ability to have quite high internal validity, actually have quite low external validity, right? So especially if you've only conducted your experiment with a bunch of college freshmen at an elite university, the way they respond to your experimental stimulus might be quite different than how people in the general population respond to it. And in fact, this has been found, and in some economics experiments, if you take any resource economics classes, one of the things you might be aware of is that experimental economists have actually figured out that they could use certain types of experimental economics protocols like public goods games or dictator games to measure norms, in essence, in a society because of the huge differences in the way different populations or samples from populations respond to these experimental stimuli. On the other hand, when we get to observational research, while it may not always be that great at being able to pin down causality, you have very high external, at least potential external validity, right? Because you can actually be using, you're getting a good population, or potentially a representative population, and you can also incorporate things that are more or less externally valid. This becomes a big issue, say, in media messaging experiments. Do you use a carefully constructed, made-up one, or do you use a real newspaper article? Obviously, the real newspaper article is going to be higher in external validity than something that you've made up that doesn't read like a real newspaper article or doesn't look like a real newspaper article. So a little bit more detail. This is a great example of the resource economics experiments that I just talked about. So early on, there were attempts by economists and also sociologists to understand how people played public goods games. If you're not familiar with a public goods game, the idea here is that there is some sort of a resource, and there are actually two versions of it. So there can be a resource in which, say, if you take from the common pool resource, you get to keep what you take. So this would be like grazing sheep in the tragedy of the commons. But if too many people graze sheep, then all the land gets eaten, and so the sheep don't produce as much as if people only produced a small amount. Or say fishing from an ocean, if people overfish, then no one gets as good of a payoff. But if everyone just fishes a small amount, they can moderate their contribution. They don't take too much. The same type of thing goes in a public goods game where, in essence, what people do is they contribute. They can either keep their $5 they're given themselves, or they contribute it to a pot. Every amount they contribute to the pot gets doubled and then split out. So in essence, if they put in their $5, it turns into $10. They only get $2.50 of it back. But if everyone puts in their $5, then everyone gets $10 back. Now, the early versions of this experiment found that economists free-rided. So especially economics students, right? Something like 8 out of 10 would keep all the money for themselves. And there were other versions of this, as I mentioned, the dictator game. Again, the money was kept for themselves. Elite college students were slightly better. So here there were maybe 6 out of 10 would keep all the money for themselves, or at least the vast majority of it. But when you got into the general population, maybe only 3 out of 10. So this was, again, the general US population, I should say, because it does play differently in Mongolia, where people, I think, only like 0 out of 10 or 1 out of 10 keep the money for themselves. I don't know if anyone actually does. So the point is that economists like to free ride, which is a great title of an article. Economists like to free ride, does anyone else? I will point out that the only other population that actually does behave consistently like the economic students is 6-year-olds. they tend to keep all the money for themselves. By the age of 8, most children even have learned social norms well enough that they behave more like elite college students or even the general population. I think it takes a little bit older to like 12 or 14 to really start to act more like the general population. The idea here is not to make fun of economists, well, at least not completely the idea, but instead to point out that you have different populations that you could draw your sample from, and this would be a great case where getting the wrong sample could actually lead you to misstate your results. They don't have the same external validity if you run the experiments on economic students than if you ran them on the general population. Another good example here is CSR experiments. So these are corporate social responsibility experiments. They are big in policy schools and also in business schools, where people want to understand how, say, green advertising or other types of, say, green contributions and greening up a company, how effective that is at increasing consumer loyalty and also increasing or changing opinions about the degree to which companies need to be regulated versus the degree to which they can be self-regulating. Now, what we happen to know or have learned over a series of research is that for young consumers, they're often quite attracted to corporate social responsibility. So they're more likely to purchase products that are green, and they also, for example, might also be less likely to want to regulate strongly companies that already are, in essence, self-regulating. Now, older consumers have an opposite. So they actually might be more likely to purchase products that are just normal, everyday products, but are somewhat suspicious of green products, perhaps because they suspect they're going to cost more, or because they don't want to be seen as that type of person, whatever that type of person is. So what we get here, do you remember, always have to remember, this is a moderated relationship. So age is moderating the relationship between corporate social responsibility and the desire to purchase a green product. So if we only gave a CSR experiment to college students, we would basically believe that the CSR advertising was super effective. And then whenever the company went to implement it out in the world and found out that in fact purchases didn't change or even dropped, because young consumers often have lower purchasing power than older consumers who typically have higher incomes, they would say, what happened? Was that experiment invalid? Was there a problem with internal validity? And the answer would be no. It was the external validity of the study, i.e. the extent to which we could generalize from our sample of college students out to the general population, that caused the problem and led us, or rather misled us, into making inferences that were not accurate. Another nice example of issues with external validity, if any of you have gone to see the lab here at the Resource Economics Lab, or have ever taken an online survey, for example, you might have seen that lab settings are often quite sterile. In fact, this one pictured here I would consider to be probably more inviting looking than many I have seen over my years of laboratory research. The one that I was associated with at one point at Oxford, at Nuffield College, you actually had to walk down about a good 200 yards down a back alley in order to access the lab. And we often wondered whether or not by the time our subjects got to the lab, if they were basically terrified that they would have been mugged or in some other way assaulted as they came in. So you could imagine that the way they were going to respond, probably having been heavily primed with fear, might actually differ depending on whether or not they were in a very cold, sterile lab, or they had to go through extraordinary, unusual pathways to get to the lab. So one of the things that Shanto Iyengar started experimenting with, I guess actually one could say, in, almost 20 or 30 years ago at this point, was the idea of trying to recreate a realistic living room experience. So he thought, well, we're doing all of this research on political advertising, but really whenever people are sitting there in the lab, they're just staring at the computer screen and really paying attention to the actual advertising that's in front of them. But what happens if we put them in a more naturalistic setting? We let some friends come over, we let them have their I guess at the time it wasn't their iPhones or their iPads, but I know that every time my son is watching TV, he's got at least 2 additional electronic devices right near him, so that he's barely paying attention to this side or the other. So what if we create this more realistic, externally valid setting, and will we get different results? And ultimately, he did find some different results. And so it's become a real standard in our discipline to think about whether or not the results we're getting actually, the setting is realistic enough to get the results, to be able to generalize about the results that we get from an experimental study. Another interesting sort of result, and I would say this was not designed as a piece of research. This was something that was sort of discovered. It was a natural experiment, shall we say. So in the Bush-Gore debate, this was, gosh, what, 2000, I guess? The people who initially, right, watched the debate, so watched it live, the more viewers thought that Gore won the debate, and that was overwhelmingly, a bunch of different surveys found that people who viewed the debate thought that Gore won the debate. But interestingly, Bush vote, so likely Bush vote, not controlling for who watched the debate and who didn't watch the debate, went up by 12 percentage points. He went from down by 8 points to up by 4 points post-debate. In other words, people who were simply assessing the debate in their own individual setting had one opinion of the debate. But ultimately, once the media and sort of conventional wisdom took hold of the post-debate analysis, and everyone basically said, well, Gore should have performed so much better, but he didn't. And Bush, who everyone had the lowest of expectations for, at least didn't embarrass himself, at least not that much. It turned out that the debates turned the tide in Bush's favor, even though the people who watched it thought he had lost. So you can see how the social setting and the social process that takes place is quite different than what we might see from simply having someone watch a political ad and decide whether or not they like it or not. And I think we saw some of the same types of dynamics right after the Trump-Clinton debates in the most recent election, where if you watch the debate, people might say, oh, well, Clinton clearly had the better over and over again, but in the end, Trump at least didn't completely, the expectations were so low that almost anything he did could have been considered good, whereas Clinton, people might be more picky about what she did. So we have to think about the differences between what you feel like whenever you view a message versus how that message plays out in a social setting. The sleeper effect presents another type of threat to external validity. The sleeper effect, which has been found in a series of experimental studies, can be described something like this. So imagine an experiment where a consumer gets a piece of information about a product. They can be told that the product is either good or bad. The source of that information can vary. It could either be directly from a brand, which is presumably biased and has an incentive to make you want to think that the product is good, or it could come from a neutral third-party organization like Consumer Reports. So results are very much what you might expect. When a potential consumer gets information from a neutral third-party source about the product, they're told that it's good, then they're more likely to buy it and they rate the product as better. And if the Consumer Report says the product is bad, the consumer will be more likely to say that the product isn't good and they are less likely to buy it. When they get the same information directly from a brand, that information is generally discounted. So being told that the product is good or bad by a particular brand, which has a stake in the outcome, has no impact whatsoever on these experimental subjects and their likelihood to buy the product that's described. Now, what's interesting is when you bring the same subjects back to the lab a week later and you again ask them about the product. In this case, a week later, they actually forget where the original information came from. They don't remember whether they were told the information by Consumer Reports or by the brand itself. They only remember whether they were told the product was good or bad. And so therefore, the originally unreliable information from the brand has the same type of impact as the reliable, originally assessed to be reliable information from the Consumer Reports. Now, we have found the same types of effects with response with regards to political information. And you could imagine this has some pretty significant implications in this era of so-called quote-unquote fake news or other types of online, far less reliable news sources where people forget whether they learned something from a reliable place like, say, the New York Times or CBS News or U.S. News and World Report, and are just as likely to remember a random Facebook post that may have originally been a lie or put together as entertainment media. Without getting too political, there are definitely some cases where we know, again from study, that factually there are many things out there masquerading as news on the internet that are not factually in any way accurate. But the sleeper effect suggests that in the real world, even though initially if you put somebody on a survey, they might be able to distinguish between more reliable and less reliable source, that once you've given them about a week, they will have forgotten the original source and simply remember as fact things that are in fact non-factual. Another potential threat to external validity can come in the form of measurement and issues with measurement that we face in cross-national studies. So this particular link is to a study on cross-national consumer studies where we find that the same types of measures of consumer preferences actually play out very differently in some countries than they do in others. In the case of political science, there hasn't been quite the same systematic work done on these cross-national invariants, measurement invariants. But from some of my own personal research, I can tell you that, for example, the way people think about the meaning of democracy can vary significantly. So we might have these cross-national studies that say, what do you think the meaning of democracy is? And or do you approve of democracy or not? But because of the fact that people believe democracy is different things in different countries, the way they rate democracy might not be invariant across countries. So I found in some studies with the Afrobarometer that survey respondents in Nigeria thought of they thought of market-based reforms and democracy as being much more connected than in a country like, say, Botswana, where market reforms were not as closely connected to the concept of democracy. So if we asked them to rate democracy, one might be rating how well the market was doing and the other might not be rating that. And that would matter a lot for how cross-nationally comparable our results are, and therefore the external validity of our results more generally.